our next in the series of biology lectures in memory of Dr. Donald Ross. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Robyn Smyth, who is at the Bard Center for Environmental Policy. Robyn is a colleague of mine. We've known each other for about 4 or 5 years now. And I'm excited that she's here to share with you some of her research. I also want to make sure everybody knows that Robyn's going to be meeting with anyone who might even have the vaguest interest in graduate school at 2:30 in Banno 253. Okay, as you're going to see, Robyn has a lot of experience both in academia as well as working for funding agencies and nonprofits. And so she's got a lot of experience that she can share about the different careers that you can do in biology, different types of graduate programs. So 2:30 in Banno 253. Okay. So Robyn did her undergrad at Cornell, and then she worked in the community for a while, and she's going to tell you a little bit about that, before going to the University of California, Santa Barbara for her PhD. From there, she did a postdoc at the Smithsonian Center for Environmental Research Center. Yeah, I knew there was a C in there.
Yeah.
And now she is on the faculty at Bard. Okay, so please welcome Dr. Smyth, and thanks for coming.
So, hi everyone. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. When I was asked several months ago, invited to come here to give a lecture, I was in the middle of preparing this research for a publication in limnology and oceanography, and I was very much in the thick of the details when I came up with this pretty complicated title. And so please don't be scared. I'm going to take it slow. Really specifically, break the title down. We'll talk about carbon sequestration, and I understand some of you are in a class that's working on the carbon cycle right now, so try and make that relevant to what you guys have got going on in class. Then I'll talk about photosynthesis, particularly marine photosynthesis. And I understand there's other students here in Gen Bio that are doing photosynthesis right now, so here's some context for that. Then I'll talk about why the Southern Ocean is important for carbon sequestration with respect to marine photosynthesis, and then just a little bit at the end about the biophysical modeling approach that we use to study it, okay? I'm totally comfortable with questions. I'm going to try to connect a lot of dots here. And so, raise your hand if I'm losing you, if you're getting confused. Put a hand up. I'm not bothered by that. I will stop and explain. So Jen, when she invited me, she said that it's helpful for the students to hear a little bit about career path and how I got where I am. And I haven't taken a particularly traditional scientist path to be a professor at the Bard Center of Environmental Policy. And I'll end by explaining what a Center for Environmental Policy actually is. I did my undergrad at Cornell, where I studied the science of Earth systems, and I was in the first class that graduated with that major at Cornell, and it was the first time that Cornell had done an interdisciplinary major that cut across their different colleges that the university is organized into. And it was very heavy on the systems thinking approach, and it really influenced me a lot going forward in terms of understanding how do ecosystems and human, and societies interact with each other, and how do we sort of make sense of this big, crazy world around us, right? And after that, I went to the University of Vermont, where I worked on a research project that was very applied. I was working on an interdisciplinary team there, and we were trying to come up with a way of evaluating the management of Lake Champlain and sort of understanding what the stakeholders around the lake wanted out of their ecosystem management. So this was very, very applied research that I enjoyed quite a bit, but I moved on from there to with a Marine Policy Fellowship in Washington, D.C., where I ended up at the National Science Foundation. And for those of you who don't know, that's where the National Science Foundation is where most of our basic research that's not related to the human body is funded by our government. And so that was a really eye-opening experience for me, and I teach in a program where I have a lot of students that go on internships in DC, and so that's a little piece of career advice and a prelude to the conversation that we'll have this afternoon, that if I highly recommend taking an opportunity and while you're students or even into your early 20s, to do an internship in DC, understand how your government works, and get that perspective. It was very helpful for me. So then, as Jen said, I was on to UC Santa Barbara for my PhD in my mid-20s. So I was a little bit later starting that, and I think that was very helpful. I moved through the PhD more efficiently than people who'd made that move straight from undergrad. I had more experience. I was focused. I ripped right through the PhD into the postdoc, which is where I started this research that I'm talking about today, and in less than 2 years was teaching at the Bard Center for Environmental Policy. So what is a Center for Environmental Policy? It's an interdisciplinary academic unit that we have at Bard. Unlike a traditional biology, chemistry, all the departments separate. We are a small faculty, interdisciplinary faculty. So I'm one of 2 scientists there. We have an economist, a political scientist, a lawyer, and let's see. And the main thing that we do there is train students in this interdisciplinary way of thinking to get professional master's degrees to go out in the world and sort of tackle our environmental problems. So here's kind of the big course areas, and we do a lot with analytical skills, GIS, and statistics, econometrics, to sort of try to understand how in the real world these things come together to create environmental problems and both to solve them, right? And so, nice to diagram it out in this very clean, like Venn diagram way, but the real world is really quite messy. And it looks a little more like this, which is both, complicated and beautiful. And this is what I like. I like where things start to merge together and it gets messy. And that's really been the only theme, perhaps, that and kind of water, are the only themes that have really run through my whole career. So, and hopefully that will come across, this interdisciplinarity and thinking about things in the big picture will hopefully come across as I go through my talk. Okay, so get into the details. First, we'll start with carbon sequestration. Why do we want to, what is carbon sequestration? Why do we care about it? You may have heard that the carbon dioxide levels in our atmosphere are increasing. This is the famous Mauna Loa, or the Keeling curve, right? That's showing the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere has been going up, and we are concerned about this because carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere trap heat, and this is leading to an overall warming of our planet, as well as a bunch of additional consequences that come sort of with this warming, more extreme events, sea level rise and droughts, and all of this stuff that I'm sure you guys have heard quite a bit about. So this is concerning people, right? And we've been trying to figure out as a society, what are we going to do about it? And we have for example, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that has been working at an international level to try to figure out a way to get us to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions to address climate change. And that process hasn't really worked very well. And we're still chugging away with our carbon-intensive economy. And so now the conversation has started to shift, not relatively recently, to start to include not just reducing our emissions, but adapting to climate change. So this is happening. It's happening now. We have to deal with it. We have to start adapting to it. And then 10 days ago, let's see. I skipped a step here. So we're concerned about this, right? And we're thinking about this in the context of the global carbon cycle. This increasing concentration, here I got the pointer here, is largely being driven by our burning of fossil fuels. But we have some interactions with the biosphere on the land and in the ocean that are helping to counteract those carbon dioxide emissions and sort of take them up a bit. So as I said, we've been talking about reducing emissions, adapting to climate change, and very recently, less than 2 weeks ago, the National Academy of Sciences released these 2 reports about climate intervention. So reflecting sunlight to cool the earth, and carbon dioxide removal and reliable sequestration. Now, has anyone ever heard of these 2 things described in another way besides climate intervention? This is kind of a rebranding of ideas that are called geoengineering. So anybody heard of geoengineering? So geoengineering is the idea that we're not reducing our emissions, climate change is going to be dangerous for us as a society, and we have to take active action to mitigate the effects of climate change. And to have these reports come out by the National Academy of Sciences, I feel geoengineering was like a fringe idea a couple of years ago, but to have the National Academy of Sciences release these reports and rebrand it as climate intervention really makes me realize these things are on the table. That we are going to attempt to manipulate our system we're on the path anyway, to potentially manipulating our Earth systems to try to counteract the effects of those carbon dioxide emissions. So, there's two main categories of approaches, and so the first one is basically manipulating the outer atmosphere to get more solar radiation to just bounce back out to space and never come down to Earth. And it seems like a reasonable idea, but there's I don't know if any of you have. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my scrolling here. Anybody ever heard of Snowpiercer? So this is a movie free on Netflix. It's up on Netflix right now, where they attempted to manipulate the atmosphere to do this very thing, and it froze the whole Earth solid, and all of Earth's remaining survivors were stuck living out their lives on this bullet train. Okay, obviously this is science fiction, but I think it does convey the idea that messing with the outer atmosphere is a little bit scary. And it's kind of like trying to put a Band-Aid on global warming, right? Not really getting at the root cause at all. And the National Academies of Science did kind of come down on the idea of reflecting sunlight back out to cool the Earth as a pretty dangerous idea and too risky. We're not really there yet scientifically to understand that. But they are putting a little more stock in the idea that we need to actively try to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So how would we go about doing that? Well, we could take the emissions from a coal-fired power plant and build some pipes and just pump the carbon dioxide into underground aquifers and geologic formations that we can just sort of pump it down there and cap it and store it. Okay, I mean, that might work, but you have to think about how much carbon dioxide goes into building all this infrastructure that enables you to do that. And when you think about taking on this kind of massive engineering project, you want to think about what's the carbon debt. How much carbon am I going to spend to build these pipes to enable this injection of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and how much carbon dioxide will I be able to put down in that hole, and will it even make up for the amount of carbon that we use to make this kind of infrastructure? So this, it seems like there's also going to be spatial limitations with that kind of approach. Now, the other approach, if we think back to the carbon cycle, what's the thing that's pulling the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere? It's photosynthesis, right? Photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, turns it into organic carbon, which it now puts it in a solid form, and it's not out there in the atmosphere trapping heat and heating up our planet. So I think of the rainforest, lots of carbon stored in the rainforest. And so one approach to dealing with the climate change issue is, well, what can we do? How can we manipulate the land to get more carbon storage on the land? And this is happening, and we call this mitigation, not just climate intervention. This kind of thing goes on in the name of mitigation. But how long-term is this storage, right? What happens when there's a forest fire that burns this forest down? What happens when our human population pressures get so great that we have to cut that forest down to plant corn? So it's not clear to me that encouraging carbon capture through forests is really gonna get us where we need to go. The other main thing that it gets talked about is fertilizing the ocean. 75% of our Earth is ocean. We're not really doing much with it besides maybe overfishing it. We're not really using it. We don't have to worry about land competition with the ocean. And there's tons and tons of photosynthesis going on out there in the ocean. So what limits that photosynthesis, and what kind of interventions could we take as humans to fertilize photosynthesis in the ocean in the hopes of capturing more carbon out of our atmosphere? So this theory of fertilizing the ocean to get more carbon capture, it involves manipulating what's called the biological pump, right? So the oceans have already taken up about a third of the carbon dioxide that we have emitted into the atmosphere. And that's through largely an inorganic process where you increase the pressure of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that forces more carbon dioxide gas dissolve in the ocean. And the ocean is deep and large, and so it just continues to absorb that carbon dioxide through an inorganic process. But that process is starting to slow down and saturate. And that's not a process that we can manipulate. Photosynthesis, on the other hand, is a process that we can potentially manipulate if we understand what's limiting the growth of phytoplankton. But it's not just about getting the phytoplankton to grow, right? The phytoplankton are the base of the food. I'm trying to find the laser here. They're the base of the food web, but they take carbon dioxide and light from the sun, they turn it into organisms. Those organisms get eaten up by other organisms, and there isn't when the organic carbon is eaten, it's respired and turned back into carbon dioxide. So to really get it out of the atmosphere in a long-term way, it's not just about stimulating photosynthesis. We actually have to get this organic carbon somehow down to the bottom of the ocean, where that's when we consider it sequestered, carbon sequestered from the atmosphere, right? And based on the studies that we've done so far, I'm using the big we here, it's only a few percent of the organic carbon that's fixed in the surface ocean that actually makes it down into the bottom of the ocean for long-term storage. A lot of it is just used to fuel the ecosystem, to fuel the growth and the respiration of other organisms, which just turn around and release that carbon dioxide gas right back into the atmosphere. So how can we stimulate photosynthesis and make sure that stimulated photosynthesis gets down to the bottom of the ocean? So this here, I put this back in here to show that, this is just kind of showing these ups and downs. That's the biological signal, right? When the growing season grows, the carbon dioxide level comes down because the carbon's been put into organic compounds. And when the growing season's over, those compounds are decomposed, carbon dioxide is returned. So we get that little bit of fluctuation, and we know that that's a biological signal. So where in the ocean where do we get this long-term storage of carbon dioxide? And this figure comes from a report published in Science over 10 years ago now by Sabine et al. And this study results from a international coordinated oceanographic study that was looking at carbon flux all across the ocean. And they did some fancy math that I'm definitely not going to talk about here, and figured out where in the ocean is the anthropogenic carbon dioxide, the carbon dioxide that we put in the atmosphere. Where is it now? Where has it gone? And we see two kind of hot spot areas. This one here is the North Atlantic, and then we see a lot of hot spot here around the Southern Ocean, right? The Southern Ocean is the circumpolar ocean along the bottom of the continents. And so these are the two places where if we look over the whole depth of the ocean water column, where we are seeing that our anthropogenic carbon dioxide actually being sequestered. So why those places? Why? Here is a picture showing what's called the thermohaline circulation, or it's also called the ocean conveyor. And this is the very slow moving current of the ocean that circulates water from the bottom to the top of the ocean. And the sort of famous part of it that you guys probably may have heard of is the Gulf Stream here. So this is the Gulf Stream. This is warm water that moves relatively quickly from low latitudes up to high latitudes, where it experiences evaporation that makes it saltier and cooling that makes it heavier, right? So, and saltier also makes it heavier. So the combination of having evaporation and cooling makes water become more dense, and when it gets up here to the North Atlantic, it sinks down to the bottom. So, this is an important mechanism for deep water formation. There's evidence that climate change is interfering with this mechanism that is starting to slow down. The other place where we have big carbon sink is down around the Southern Ocean, because that's also a place where we have deep water formation. It's much more complicated than the North Atlantic deep water formation because of the circumpolar nature of that the ocean down there. There's sort of a lot more complexities to how the water is moving. But we have also deep water formation around Antarctica, which has led to a lot of interest in what's happening with photosynthesis in that region. The other thing that we notice about the Southern Ocean, and this is a plot, the top two panels are showing it's a winter and summer are the side by side. The top panels are chlorophyll concentration. So this is used as a metric for photosynthesis and where it's occurring. And so you see in this is the northern latitude summer, where we have more light in the summer, we have more photosynthesis going on here. In the winter, we have more photosynthesis going on in the southern hemisphere. And this bottom plot is showing us a graph of nutrients. So if we want to stimulate photosynthesis, we need to think about what's limiting photosynthesis from currently happening. And in the ocean, it's nitrogen is the most commonly limiting nutrient for marine photosynthesis. And so this bottom plot here is showing that down at the bottom in the Southern Ocean, we have a ton of nitrogen, nitrates specifically. So what's happening down there? If we think of nitrogen as being the limiting agent for growth, how come all of this nitrogen is hanging out? Why isn't there more photosynthesis happening? That would be a key thing that we need to understand. So, here's what's limiting the phytoplankton growth in the Southern Oceans. We've got carbon dioxide, water, we need nutrients and sunlight. That makes phytoplankton grow and release oxygen. So that's the basic sort of photosynthesis equation. So what are the nutrients involved here? Well, nitrogen is the main one. That's the one that phytoplankton will need the most of. Next in line is phosphorus. Those two are considered the macronutrients. And organisms need a lot of those two nutrients in the process of fixing carbon. After that come a series of micronutrients, iron, silicon, magnesium, that organisms need in much smaller proportions, but can also be limiting for growth. The other thing, let's see what's next. So the Southern Ocean, basically there's evidence through experimentation that iron is largely limiting phytoplankton growth in the Southern Ocean. And so here's a cute little cartoon that is indicating that, well, we just take a ship and we dump some iron into the ocean, phytoplankton will grow, they'll sink down to the bottom, carbon sequestered, right? Should it be that easy? If only. So let's see. It's a little more complicated than that, and there's more going on than simply iron limitation in the Southern Ocean. So there's a whole nother camp of people that are studying the effects of light on photosynthesis and whether light is potentially limiting or co-limiting, like limiting at the same time, photosynthesis as well as iron. And so there's also evidence of light limitation in the Southern Ocean. And this is because, as we talked about, there's this deep water that's being formed there. The mixing layers are deep. We're talking about the bottom of the Earth where the solar angles are low. And so there's less light at the surface. There's less light going into the water column. The plankton are mixed over really deep water columns so overall they get a pretty low dose of light. And to maximize their ability to grow under those conditions, they tend to accumulate a lot of chlorophyll molecules. So chlorophyll is a light harvesting molecule. It's what takes the sun's energy and sort of starts the process of photosynthesis. So plankton that live in low light conditions will grow a lot of chlorophyll so that they can try to get as much light as they can in those kinds of conditions. But chlorophyll as a light harvesting pigment is also can make them vulnerable, because just like when we go out in the sun without our sunscreen on, when the UV index is high and we get a sunburn, phytoplankton can also get a sunburn. And it's the chlorophyll particularly is one of the areas that are very sensitive to high doses of ultraviolet radiation. So the UV dose can fry those chlorophyll molecules and then reduce the capacity of those phytoplankton cells to light harvest and therefore photosynthesize. The situation with light is further complicated by ozone depletion over the Southern Ocean. So the ozone hole, like, aren't we over that? Didn't we fix that problem? Yes, we did, in the sense that we got together. The situation with the ozone hole was that it was being created by chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, which we were using in industrial processes. They were getting up into the outer atmosphere and interfering with the formation of ozone and causing ozone to deplete. And these molecules were particularly accumulating over the southern hemisphere, making this ozone hole. The ozone hole lets more UV in, because the ozone layer is kind of like the sunscreen for the Earth. And so we put a hole in our sunscreen, and we're letting in more UVB down in this region where plankton are potentially already quite sensitive to light. So the ozone hole, when we banned using CFCs in '89 with the Montreal Protocol, it was a very successful political endeavor, but really it stabilized the ozone hole, and it's still going to be a couple decades before it actually, through natural processes, actually fixes itself up. So it's not getting worse anymore, it's just sort of persisting, and it's still complicating the situation with respect to photosynthesis in the Southern Ocean. Okay, so now I'm starting to get into what my actual research is on. I was working on my postdoc at the Smithsonian in the photobiology lab. So the theme of this lab was looking at how UV affects all different sorts of processes, and photosynthesis being one of them. And so when we think about radiation and solar radiation and what happens when it hits a light surface, so hopefully those of you that have taken Professor Klug's class might know that light attenuates exponentially with depth. So there's the most light at the surface, but then as you get deeper, you have less light in an exponential way. The ultraviolet radiation tends to attenuate faster than the wavelengths that the phytoplankton actually want to use to perform photosynthesis. And it ends up in the Southern Ocean. In the case where we have deep mixing, is you end up with these three sort of light zones. This top light zone where the UV is damaging, this middle light zone called the euphotic zone, where conditions are good. There's light and conditions are good for photosynthesis and growing. And then the aphotic zone down here below, where the light is fully attenuated and it's dark, and the phytoplankton just sort of exist in that zone, waiting for the circulation to bring them back to the light, right? So phytoplankton in the Southern Ocean, in the deeply mixed layers, are sort of circulating through these three zones. A zone where they get damaged, a zone where they get where they're happy photosynthesizing, and a zone where there's not enough light for them to photosynthesize. And we want to understand how this process works, because when they're getting damaged up here, they're still damaged when they get into this good light zone. So we need to understand not just what the light is like in a certain zone, but how quickly they circulate through, how damaged do they get, how long does it take them to get repaired, and what does this mean for the overall productivity, photosynthesis in that water column. So the research that I am working on, I was doing some modeling research that's based off of research that was done on a cruise, like a 4-week, I think, cruise on an ice-breaking ship in the Ross Sea Polynya here adjacent to Antarctica. And a polynya is a seasonally ice-covered region of the ocean. And these parts of the Southern Ocean tend to be the most productive parts of the Southern Ocean. So the Ross Sea is here's the site, and it is I think the next one, yeah. Here's a picture from space of the algae bloom that happens in the spring in the Ross Sea Polynya. So the spring comes, the ice cover that's covering the sea ice that's covering the ocean starts to melt back and sort of approach the continent, opens up the water to more light, and you get a big bloom of usually Phaeocystis is the if for anybody who's into plankton, Phaeocystis bloom. So you can see from space, this big burst of chlorophyll, and so they were with the cruise ship, studying both what was happening physically in the ocean and doing experiments, collecting water samples from the ocean and running experiments on the ship deck to understand how this particular blooming community was responding to different light treatments, so that we could then use that in modeling the light exposure. So at the time when they were making these observations and carrying out these experiments, they also saw on the ocean surface, and this is a picture from that cruise. Here's the ice shelf back there, and this is like 100, I used to remember, I didn't take this picture, I wasn't here, but my boss had told me how big that was. I can't remember. It's a very big ice sheet, like if the ship would be like a little blip up next to it. So big ice sheet, and you see this striped pattern in the ocean surface. So you see this in the ocean, you might see this on a big lake. This is a sign of a process that's called Langmuir circulation. And basically what happens is the wind blows across the surface of the ocean and it pushes the water. But because the Earth is rotating and there's like a rotational force in the ocean water, as it moves, it starts to turn. And it creates these big cells and so these windrows are the evidence of the formation of these big circular Langmuir cells. And so you have two that rotate together, and they make a convergent zone, then they rotate the next two rotate apart. And so what you see on the surface is these convergent zones where you've got two cells coming together and rotating down. Now, Langmuir circulation is a particular mechanism of ocean circulation that's very efficient at moving things very quickly from the surface of the ocean down to deep water. So, we're concerned about how much high light exposure those phytoplankton get, how much darkness they can get, and how much time they have in that zone where they can really conduct photosynthesis. And this physical mechanism is going to bring the phytoplankton through those different zones very quickly. And so this is why we need a biophysical modeling approach, right? So we need a physical model so that we can understand how the phytoplankton are circulating in the ocean water, and because that circulation determines their specific light exposure, which in turn determines how much photosynthesis they can carry out. And we need a biological model that tells us how the phytoplankton are going to respond to a particular dose of light. Including the wavelengths, like the UV versus the visible light. And so this is the work this is what I've been working on. Is first we constructed a time-dependent photosynthesis model based on those experiments done on the ships, and then we worked with some folks at the University of South Florida who do large eddy simulations to try to replicate physically the conditions that were present in the ocean at the time that these experiments were done, that we used to parameterize our photosynthesis model. So when it comes to vertical mixing and photosynthesis, this is kind of like an age-old question in both oceanography and in limnology. We know that photosynthesis depends on light, and we know that mixing changes the light regime. And so how does mixing, what's the net effect of mixing on photosynthesis is kind of one of these big questions that I don't even want to think about how many research dollars have been put into sort of understanding that in a lot of different contexts and a lot of different aquatic ecosystems over several decades. And so when it comes to Langmuir circulation, because it's that really efficient circular, we think of it as this really efficient circular motion, it's been oftentimes replicated in biological studies with just simple circles. We just think of those phytoplankton going around in the same circle. They're circling. And so this is used as a physical model to represent what the plankton are experiencing in the actual ocean. Other studies that look at photosynthesis and vertical mixing think about the turbulence of the upper ocean. And it's, the surface ocean is very active. We can't see it, but there's a lot going on in there. And there's an approach that considers turbulence as a random process and says, okay, well, if the surface ocean is turbulent, then the particles are just moving around randomly. And you can use a model that generates trajectories for particles or, phytoplankton cells that look like these that are just completely random. So then we worked with a couple of modelers that do a certain type of modeling called large eddy simulation, which is really high-end, computationally intensive modeling that actually solves the equations of motion of the ocean. And it takes, for our study, we used the physical conditions of the Ross Sea to run the large eddy simulation model and to output these trajectories, and it took like 3 weeks to a month to run the model for a 24-hour period. So it's not a particularly practical way of studying the ocean when it takes you 3 weeks to find out what happened in one day. Like 3 weeks of what do you call it? Like mainframe, like networked computers, like supercomputer. Yeah. So this is, not something that I can just like whip up on my desktop. But you see, when you look at what that really computationally intensive modeling gives you, is a vertical path for these phytoplankton that's a mix of this circular trajectory, like you see right here. It's kind of it's going up, and it's, for the most part, it's going down. It has a little bit of a blip here, but you see this pattern, but you also see this random turbulence embedded around it. So the actual mixing in the ocean is a combination of this coherent vertical circular structure and the randomness of an actively mixing ocean. And that gives you trajectories that look like this, which will have a certain light history that goes along with them. So does it matter? Does it matter how we treat how the phytoplankton cells move, and therefore the kind of light exposure that they have? So here's a figure of the large eddy simulation that just kind of shows, this is that Langmuir thing. This one's going into the board and this one's coming out. So anyway, that's just a picture of what my collaborators did. Okay, so what does this all mean for estimating what the actual productivity is in the Southern Ocean? And the standard way that oceanographers estimate how photosynthesis varies with depth in the ocean is to basically collect up a sample of water, put it in some kind of container, and then hook a bunch of containers together at some kind of spacing and drop it back in the ocean and let them fix carbon for a certain amount of time, take them back out, and then measure it, right? So that's called in situ incubation. And so that is the main way that we understand how you get this curve. So you have the most light up at the top, and so the most photosynthesis, and as the light goes down, the rate of photosynthesis goes down. And you can do these kinds of studies without taking into account the fact that the phytoplankton can get sunburned. And if you don't account for the sunburn, then typically you're going to see a profile that happens like this. But because of what happens up in this damaging zone, we actually see the actual photosynthesis curve move to the left here, and this is that inhibition effect. This is that effect of too much UV exposure damaging the cellular structure of the phytoplankton. So this is what we would see if we actually used that approach where we had these moorings there. But the problem with that approach of just putting the phytoplankton in a bag, setting them in one place, letting them photosynthesize, is that they're not mixing when you're doing that measurement. And yet we know that the variation in their light is important. And so the only way to really get at that question is through a modeling approach. And so here is showing the different kinds of ways that we accounted for vertical mixing. And so you see that when we just thought only about the randomness of the turbulence in the ocean, we get this red curve here that looks a lot like the curve where they're just standing still. It's because they're moving randomly, but they're on average not getting very far. They're moving up a little bit, they're moving down a little bit. They're not fundamentally changing their light regime very much. And so the model results there sort of look very much like the static observations that were collected in the field that we know aren't right. And the simple circles actually give us a lot less photosynthesis at all. You see this curve moved way to the left. Those circular trajectories show a lot of inhibition. And that's because the cells are going around, they're all following the same path, they're all going in the same motion, and they're all getting exactly the same light exposure. It's too much for them. And so over time, they sort of accumulate this sunburn effect, and you get less productivity. And the large eddy simulation approach that we use, that really computationally intensive one, gives you something in between when you look at it just in the vertical. But when we're thinking about productivity, photosynthesis in the ocean, we don't want to know, we want to know what's the whole water column doing together, what's the total net effect. And so this figure is showing the model results sort of summed over the depth of the whole mixing layer. And the blue line shows what you would estimate the photosynthesis to be if you didn't take into account the sunburn effect, right? If you just ignored it altogether, you would think that the productivity looked like this. The black lines show that with the large eddy simulations, with those trajectories that are both coherent and turbulent, you have a reduction in photosynthesis, but not nearly as much of a reduction as with the other approaches. The green line is showing the non-moving particles and the ones that are just turbulent, and the red lines are showing different cases of doing the circular trajectories where they're moving really fast and accumulating a lot of damage. So the take-home message really here is that marine photosynthesis is pretty complicated business, and the details matter. How we represent that photosynthesis, how we represent their light exposure, their access to nutrients, the timing of the way that the ocean changes really influences our outcomes. And so, depending on how complicated of a modeling approach we used, we got several, relatively different answers with respect to how much photosynthesis there really was. And so this research is focused in on a very narrow part of the bigger question of understanding photosynthesis in the ocean overall. So we're looking at in one specific place, at one one location, one time of year, and looking specifically at the light effects. We didn't even include nutrients, actually. Nutrient limitation doesn't factor into our model. We assume that because the phytoplankton are deeply mixing, they have access to the nutrients that they need. So we ignore that. Meanwhile, the people who are doing the iron fertilization studies are ignoring the light effects. And we need to put all of these pieces together to really understand what is going on in the ocean and what's the capacity for this biological pump to really work, and our ability to estimate how much carbon dioxide we're capturing, through photosynthesis. And then another group of scientists that would study the effects of how it sediments and gets captured by sequestration. So there's a lot of science and scientists that need to that study very specific pieces of this problem that all have to be able to come together to develop a more collective understanding of how photosynthesis is happening in the southern, in the ocean in general. And while this makes for a really nice cartoon, and this might be appealing to politicians who don't want to have to deal with the carbon emission problem, it's just not going to be this easy to just dump some iron in the ocean and sort of get more carbon capture out of it. We are still in the process of building our understanding enough to understand how and where this will work, how much carbon we could get out of a process like this. It's not straightforward stuff. So that's it. Thanks.
Okay, we have time for some questions, so fire away. I have some questions, but I will wait and let someone else ask questions.
Will the increasing productivity affect your cells?
Yeah, so I didn't mention that. When we talk about ocean fertilization, I mean, we actually are fertilizing the ocean all the time in the coastal zones, right? So rivers export nutrients to the coastal ocean, and in a couple of really famous examples, the Gulf of Mexico and the Chesapeake Bay, there's so much nutrients coming off the land that they're fertilizing those coastal zones and estuaries of the ocean, that they're producing more phytoplankton than can be sort of incorporated into the ecosystem without further impacts. And so, what your question was?
Will the increase in photosynthesis in the
right. So will it increase dead zones? And that's definitely something that is, if you start looking into these documents about geoengineering and ocean fertilization and the new term climate intervention, that's a concern. Where we don't want to be doing this in places where we know we already have eutrophication problems, and the coastal ocean zones aren't zones of deep water formation, and so you have less risk in those regions of having a dead zone occur because you have this continuous process that's taking the water from the surface and moving it down to the deep ocean and sort of diluting it in the vastness of the bottom of the ocean. And so because of the rate at which the waters are moved from the surface, that's not a concern in that region, but that would be a concern why we can't just sort of generally fertilize the ocean. I mean, that's one of the reasons why the Southern Ocean is kind of a focus. I mean, the fact that it's iron limitation and not nitrogen limitation is another important one, because you need about 40 molecules of nitrogen for every 1 molecule, or for every 100 molecules of carbon dioxide that you fix, and so that's a lot. It's like a massive amount of nitrogen that you would really need to stimulate a lot of production. But iron is a micronutrient that you need in a much smaller amount, and so that it seems to people to be more feasible to sort of fertilize with iron, because we wouldn't have to transport quite as much of it. But yeah, the oxygen thing shouldn't be an issue in that situation, but certainly something to be concerned about in other places.
It's my recollection that this idea of fertilizing with iron has been around for decades.
Mm-hmm.
Is this really still on the table?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, yes. So there have been a total, as far as my understanding is that there have been a total of 12 iron fertilization experiments that have been done, which isn't very many if you think about how much oceanography research is going on.
In situ?
In situ fertilization experiments, yeah. And part of the reason for that is that the activities that are considered geoengineering are banned by international governance regimes, and so which actually kind of date back to nuclear testing issues, where there's international agreements that say we're not going to do things that could mess with the whole world, and so countries have kind of already agreed to that, and there are people who are concerned about climate change and think that we need to do more than just try to turn down emissions, that are pushing for geoengineering, climate interventions, and but right now there's pretty much a ban on research in those areas because of these international agreements. So you can really only look at these things through modeling largely, and so I think with these National Academy of Science reports, for me, they really bring the idea of geoengineering from the fringe into the mainstream. It makes me think that it really is on the agenda more, and what they're calling for is more research and strategic, internationally coordinated research, so that we are prepared in the future to implement these climate intervention strategies.
You never mentioned temperature at all. Is temperature fluctuation not an aspect of this at all in terms of photosynthesis?
Yeah, I mean, all biological processes tend to slow down when temperatures are cold, and so the photosynthesis, there is some temperature effect on the photosynthesis in the Southern Ocean. It is a little slower than it would be in the middle of the tropical ocean because of the temperature effect. But yeah, that it's not. It makes for slower repair processes and things like that. It can be a part of why the UV radiation is part of the problem, is that slower biological processes because of temperature. But it's variation. The variation in temperature isn't a factor that we were looking at here. Did I see another hand over here?
Yeah, I
don't want this to sound pessimistic, especially with so many students, but when I read about the report, what I was thinking was, okay, the people that really know what's going on have kind of thrown in the towel. You know, we got fracking, we got this endless swapping over the Keystone Pipeline. We're never going to be able to reduce emissions, and the experts are telling us. Is that really true, or is there hope? Because I try to be a hopeful person. Is there any hope that we can reduce emissions in addition to doing other things?
Really big question. I mean, this is the question that we grapple with at the Center for Environmental Policy all the time. You know, climate change is front and center for us, and we have students working on all sorts of projects related to different aspects of the climate change challenge. And yeah, I mean, there's people who view geoengineering and climate interventions as a slippery slope activity, and they don't even want to see the research done because they're worried that spending money on this research is like putting us on a path of intervention, and it's coming at the expense, that it's going to come at the expense of our efforts to mitigate and reduce emissions. That, you know, and that, I mean, you can see when you look, if you look at this, you know, a picture like this, I mean, think of the appeal this has to a politician who doesn't, well, you know, who doesn't want to deal with the tough problems of getting the carbon dioxide to not be put into the atmosphere. And you look at something like this, and this is going to have a lot of appeal. So this, yeah, it's a complex issue, and there are definitely voices out there that are saying, you know, that we don't even want to do this research because it's going to put us on the path to actually having to take these interventions. The flip side of that is, if we don't do the research and climate change gets bad enough and things get serious enough, we may end up doing something like this, like willy-nilly, without the information and the science that we would have wanted to do it the best that we possibly can. So pick your side, I guess. Yeah.
So help me a little bit with the scale. We know what the net primary production is on the land, and I presume there's pretty good numbers for ocean plankton total.
Yeah.
And you saw that little piece going off, which actually gets sequestered. If you look at that absolute number for the Southern Ocean and the North Atlantic, you know, I don't know how, and you compare that number, the amount of carbon being sequestered now,
Yeah.
okay, and compare it to the amount of new carbon being brought up every year and produced in the fossil fuels.
Yeah.
Is it an order of magnitude difference between those? I mean, how much of this would we need
Yeah.
to have a significant effect?
That is math I have not done. But let's get to the, I'm trying to find the cycle here. Here it is. Okay, so you've got about this, and this is a little bit old now, but 7.2 gigatons of carbon per year in emissions.
That is our old fossil fuels being brought back up into the biosphere.
Right. So this is, this is what you want to kind of amend for, right? And you get about, our estimates are that the terrasphere, the terrestrial biosphere, is taking up 1 of these 7, and that the ocean is taking up over 2. And so ultimately, my understanding is that this excess carbon dioxide ultimately over sort of geologic timescales is going to all end up back in the ocean. Like 90% of it is going to, end up back in the ocean. But there are a lot of complications with like uptake rate. So even if you fertilize the ocean and you get you give them the nutrient that they need to grow right now, something else is going to come limiting. And that other thing, it may be light, but it may be carbon dioxide itself if you fertilize enough, because there's a certain rate at which carbon dioxide can move from the atmosphere into the surface of the ocean. And if, it has to be in the ocean for the phytoplankton to use it. And so there are a lot of time, bottlenecks, constraints on this process that, make me really wonder if...
I know the fossil fuels, that was millions of years.
Right.
It was all terrestrial atmospheric carbon at one point. But it took millions of years to bury.
Yeah. So here is the number of how much is getting buried, and that I've seen 4, I've seen 0.4, I've seen 0.5. So it's right here in this ballpark right now. And so how much can we crank this up? who knows? And what kind of consequences might that have? Well, what's going to trickle through the marine ecosystems if we do that, right? Hard to say.
I a couple questions, but you had talked about the fact that the ozone hole is stabilized. It's going to be fixed at some point if
It is healing.
It's healing. So how much is that going to affect the photo inhibition in that surface waters once it is fixed?
Yeah. So in the future, we're going to have less UVB in the Southern Ocean. But let me see if it's down. I have extra slides at the end. Hold on. Oh wait, there's recording. I'm not sure how this works. I won't touch that. So there will be less UVB, but it's not just the UVB that's inhibiting the phytoplankton. They're actually inhibited by UVA and even by the photosynthetically active radiation in part. So just closing the ozone hole takes away the most damaging wavelengths, but doesn't ameliorate the problem altogether. But the poles are changing, rapidly, more rapidly than the mid latitudes, and with warming in water bodies tends to come a shallowing of the stratification. So the Southern Ocean is really characterized by these very, very deep mixing layers that warming might shallow up, which would make the overall average light exposure higher, which should translate into less sensitivity of the phytoplankton themselves. So I think that the actual warming has more of a potential to give us more photosynthetic capacity through a change in the average light exposure, and therefore the phytoplanktons what kind of light climate they're adapted to.
How much of a driver is this photosynthesis in terms of controlling the sequestration of carbon dioxide? Is it,
Right. So how
you
much?
have some just absorbed into the ocean.
Right.
So how much is it actually adding to that?
The photosynthesis into what just is happening sort of through the inorganic process. There's variability in the numbers that are out there, but most of the carbon dioxide that the ocean has taken up so far is through the physical chemical mechanism of dissolution of carbon dioxide and sort of bicarbonate buffering, which gets you into the whole ocean acidification, which is a whole nother can of worms. But so there's a couple of steps in the process. There's how much organic carbon can you fix, and then how quickly can you get it out of the surface ocean and separated from the zone where it can just be respired and available for re-release into the ocean. And that's a process that we can't easily manipulate the deep water formation. I mean, amongst the geoengineering options includes actually pumping organic carbon down to the bottom of the ocean, and not, so because we can fertilize the growth, but we can't manipulate the deep water formation. I think hopefully we think that that's beyond our capacity. That's a really complex process, but we could be trying. There are other voices talking about let's just pump it. Let's pump the carbon down, the organic carbon down to the bottom of the ocean. But then you get again into this carbon debt issue of how much carbon do you spend to build the infrastructure to pump the organic carbon down to the bottom of the ocean. But the bottom of the ocean is probably the best reservoir. It's the most long-term reservoir we have. And so if you're choosing between manipulating photosynthesis on the land or manipulating photosynthesis in the ocean, I mean, my bias is obviously towards aquatic ecosystems, but it seems like there is more potential for longer-term storage with the ocean and with land because of how inaccessible the bottom of the ocean is to us.